Thank you. Please be seated. What am I going to tell you?
Still under oath.
You ready, Ms. Schuler? Thank you, Mr. Shaughnessy.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon, Doctor.
Hello.
My name's Tom Shaughnessy. I think you and I talked about 2 weeks ago.
Yes.
We talked on the phone for a bit,
Yes.
and I asked you a number of questions about the subject matter for which you just got done testifying, correct?
Yes.
Doctor, we went over all of the injuries that you just described, correct?
Yes.
And we talked about a number of theories and concepts and possibilities, correct?
We did.
One of the first things we talked about was the distinction between pre or ante-mortem and post-mortem, correct?
We did discuss that, yes.
And we also discussed a phenomena or theory in
In reference to an injury that occurs during, after a lethal injury. There, the injury does not have mortem characteristics.
And you've described injuries here today, Mr. Russell, that range from being immediately fatal or nearly immediately fatal,
Yes.
which is number
Do, yes.
2, injuries non-fatal. Depending on the time from the first injury to the last, that each injury could appear to be perimortem, right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And then minutes later, there was no hemorrhaging on the second wound.
That's correct.
Okay. So when somebody's injured in a very rapid succession, almost immediately fatal, and one wound might not be fatal at all, if that happens within seconds, they'll all continue to hemorrhage, correct?
If the heart is still beating, yes.
Okay. And we also talked about kind of I think I got to give you a rudimentary analogy. Discussed in the body like a garden hose that pulls it.
As long as the heart is still pumping to provide the pressure, yes.
Right. Okay. Now, when you number the injuries, that isn't a sequence that you know that they occurred in that order, is it?
No.
Okay. Fair to say you start at the top and move to the bottom? Okay. You call or 15 in that order?
No.
When you examine the body, what do you call that when it's prone with the palms out?
Anatomic position.
Okay. Anatomic position, correct?
For the most part, yes. He's laying back on a table.
And when you do angles or trajectories, the anatomic position, not necessarily the position of the person when they suffered the injury. Because very few people are in the anatomic position to sustain. I'll go with supine.
I agree with supine.
Agree with supine. All right. So from the anatomic position is how you measure your trajectories and direction.
Directions, yes.
Okay. Now, you and I also had a conversation, and what we said is that you could almost contort the human body into any position so that you could say the muzzle to target was from there, correct?
Yeah, I mean, relatively speaking.
Okay. Well, if we wanted to say that you shot me from there, if I'm like this, it would come through here, right?
And it would most likely have an upward trajectory because you're bent over.
And if I'm like that,
Yes,
it would be a different trajectory?
exactly.
Okay. So how the person holds the muzzle or aims it can impact that trajectory, correct?
Yes,
And how the person or the target is positioned can also affect it, correct?
yes,
Kind of like we talked about, kind of like playing Twister. You can contort the body all the way around in an effort to say that the shot came from a particular direction.
yes,
Okay. So if there was a shot in the back and you want to say it came through the front windshield, you'd have to say that Mr. Russell had his back to the windshield, right?
yes.
Okay.
If
That's
I'm
what you want.
understanding you correctly, yes.
Well, if you take his body
If
and
he
you,
has an entry wound on his back, you mean?
Right.
Yes, that's correct.
okay, if he has an entry wound on his back and you want to tell somebody that that came through the front windshield, then you'd have to twist his body such that his back was facing the front windshield in the proper.
In the proper orientation, yes.
Let's talk about gunshot wound number 1 for a few moments.
Okay,
Fatal, correct?
yes,
You said if there was some amount of medical care, then it might not.
unlikely, but maybe.
If he were at the Cleveland Clinic and you had a brain surgeon there and the OR was ready and he sustained that injury,
If enough medical intervention was able to alleviate the brain swelling that would follow, it is possible that maybe he could live after wound number 1 only.
but again, you'd almost have to have that wound happen in the operating room.
It would need, yes, not right.
And
yes.
the surgeon ready, right?
And the surgeon ready, and the internist ready, and everybody there ready.
Not EMS to ER to OR.
Right.
Okay. Now, you say that that's nearly immediately incapacitated, correct?
Most likely, yes.
Okay. Mr. Bell asked you if you could drive, right?
After number 1, probably not driving.
Okay. When you say nearly immediately, what does that mean?
Very quickly.
I mean, immediately means right now, right?
You know, I don't want to put a time frame on it, but nearly immediate would be short seconds.
Okay. If it's nearly immediately incapacitating, do I possess any motor skills if I suffer that injury?
You might. This injury goes through the left basal ganglia, and the basal ganglia are part of your movement, part of the brain that controls your movement or is involved in your movement. So likely you're not going to be moving much after wound 1.
If I suffered wound 1 first alone, and I'm sitting upright as you are, I'm going to slump, and I'm probably not will I be able to lift my arms up?
Probably not.
Would I be able to press down on a gas pedal?
No.
Would I be able to steer a car?
No.
Could I bend over and then bend back up?
Not by yourself. No.
Not by myself. Wound number 2. Okay. Immediately incapacitating?
Yes.
Okay. Can't drive a car?
Nope.
Can't press the gas?
No.
Can't move my pinkies?
No.
My little toes?
No.
Okay. I have no motor control immediately, correct?
No motor control.
Okay. So if I'm bent over, I can't sit up?
No.
Now, you and I talked about wounds 1 and 2, and while they're not in exact same positions, obviously, they both share some characteristics. They're back to front, correct?
Yes.
The wound comes from the back to the front,
Yeah, and yes.
and they're both right to left.
Yes.
Okay. So they're both back to front and right to left, correct?
Yes.
And you and I had a conversation then about if you're sitting in a car, where those wounds could have been sustained from, correct?
Yes.
And we talked about different possibilities around the car, correct?
We did.
We talked about could they have come from the rear through the back window, correct?
We did.
And you indicated to me that that could occur within a reasonable degree of scientific certainty.
It's possible, but not likely.
Okay, it's possible. Then we talked about wounds 1 and 2 coming from the side of the hill,
We
heading
did.
up in this direction, correct?
Yes.
And you indicated to me that that's certainly possible
Yes.
for both wounds 1 and 2.
More possible for 2.
Okay. But just as a
Yes,
generalization,
in general, yes.
possible for both of them, correct?
Yes.
And then you indicated to me that it's also possible, if the head is put in the right position, for them to have come from the hood of the Malibu, correct?
Yes.
And or from the trunk of 238, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now let's talk about wound number 1 for a moment. Wound number 1 goes front to back and left to right, correct?
Back to front.
Back to front, left to right.
No.
Right to left.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. It's already late. Wound number 1, back to front, right to left, correct?
Yes.
All right. Now, we had a conversation about the position that the head would have to be in order for wound number 1 to come from the hood of the Malibu, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, we can see it on the dummy, but if I'm sitting in the car and I'm prone, that wound could come from the hill, correct? If I'm sitting up like this and driving, correct?
Wound number 1.
Yes.
Wound number 1 enters the top left of the head. If you're sitting up, it came through the roof of the car.
Okay, well, we'll get to that in a minute.
It did not come from the right side of the car.
Get that. If it came through the windshield, how far down is my head?
Maybe how far you are now, maybe 45 degrees-ish.
Okay, so for wound number 1, which is almost immediately incapacitating and is fatal or lethal unless it happens in the OR at the Cleveland Clinic, in order for that to happen, I'd have to be slumped forward at 45 degrees in the driver's seat if that were to come from through the windshield, correct?
Close to there, yes.
Okay. And we've already established that I would have no motor skills, correct?
If you had any, they would be very minimal, yes.
Okay. Well, after sustaining wound number 1 at 45 degrees here and losing all motor skills, you'd slump forward, correct?
Yeah,
Okay.
if there were no other injuries, no other impacts.
Or you'd slump forward into the steering wheel, rather, right?
If you're behind the steering wheel, yes.
Okay. So he's in the driver's seat where we found him, right?
Well, he's not really behind the steering wheel.
Well, we found him all the way over
He
here.
was more towards the middle of the car, yes.
All right. But you've indicated that you wouldn't possess the motor skills to be able to lift yourself back up
That's correct.
after number 1.
That's correct.
So if number 1 was sustained through the front windshield, Timothy Russell would be slumped into the steering wheel.
If that was the last wound he received, yes.
Well, even if it were the first wound that he received,
No.
hang on, let me finish the question. If he loses his motor skills with that wound, how is he going to sit back up?
If there are additional impacts to his chest, there will be kinetic energy transferred to his body that can push him.
So what you're telling us is that he suffers wound number 1 from the front of the windshield, and he slumps into the steering wheel, right? And then you're saying there's going to be sufficient kinetic energy while he's slumped into the steering wheel that's going to come into the car, it's going to push him back, lift his head up, and then move it over.
Well, I think that's not accurate. If For wound number 1 to be where it is and come from the front windshield, all that's necessary is his head is down.
Okay.
So he doesn't really have to be leaned way over.
Now,
His head is down. It could come from over here if his head is this way.
Right.
And we know his head was that way for
Right.
3 and 9. So potentially 1 is from this direction, from the passenger side.
It's off to the passenger side, correct?
Right.
Okay. Now, you said that 1 couldn't have come from off the passenger side because it didn't come through the roof, right?
No.
Did you say that number 1 could have come from up to the right on the passenger side, but there were no holes in the roof, so it couldn't have?
No, that's not what I said.
What did you say?
It could, if wound number 1 came from a position to the right of the vehicle, it would have had to come through the top portion of the windows. It would have been still at an elevated angle, or at an increased angle in order to hit there. There are no holes in the hood of the car. Sorry, hood's the wrong word. Roof of the car. So I know that 1 and 2 did not come through the roof of the car, but they potentially could have come through the upper portion of the passenger side windows. Does that make sense?
Sure. And that's premised on the fact that there's no holes in the roof.
Exactly.
Okay. So your opinion of wounds number 1 and 2 is based upon your understanding that there were no holes in the roof of the Mallory.
No.
About what you just said. You said there's no hole in the roof.
My opinion of where the shot was fired from is based on the fact that there are no holes in the roof. My interpretation of the wounds has nothing to do with the holes in the car.
Your interpretation of where the shot came from is based on the premise that there's no hole in the roof.
Yes,
For
correct.
wounds 1 and 2.
Yes.
Okay. And where did you get that information that there were no holes in the roof?
I looked at the car.
Well, if I told you for purposes of this questioning that we've already received testimony from the Bureau of Criminal Identification and that they've indicated that there was a hole in the passenger side roof and that it was downward from 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock and it perforated the roof into the passenger compartment, would that be new information to you?
Yes, it would.
Okay. And when I say, can I approach the witness?
Sure.
Showing you what's been marked as Defendant's Exhibit E, can you take a look at that? Down here, bullet hole 88. There's another picture.
Okay.
Okay. So BCI uses, for purposes of my questions, a numbering system of 12, 1, 2, 3. Okay? 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and back around like a clock. Okay?
Okay.
Now, this came from 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock, if you read their report here, perforated into the passenger compartment.
Okay.
Okay? And now you've got a picture of that there, right?
If this information is accurate, then this particular one that you're talking about, this bullet hole 88, potentially could be 1 or 2.
Okay.
Yes.
So again, the premise that there was no hole in the roof, the PCI has previously testified to a hole in the roof there, and that that is correct, and that it came from 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock. I'm sorry, I'm blocking it. It came from 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock, and the shot that's going to the roof is coming in the direction I'm pointing, correct?
Yes.
And that certainly would account for either bullet hole number 1 or bullet hole number 2, or wound 1 or wound 2.
It could.
Okay.
Is it your area of expertise to comment on whether a bullet that goes through the roof of this car has sufficient energy to cause the damage you see in wounds 1 or 2?
Yes, I have the Well, no, I'm going to say no, because I'm not an expert on what a bullet does when it passes through a car or a door or anything like that. I only know what a bullet does when it passes through a body.
Okay. Do you know what a bullet can do after it passes through a body? In other words, what it can go through after that?
Sure, it can go through more than one body. It depends on the ammunition,
No. Okay.
the weapon, and lots of factors.
All right. Thank you for that, and pardon the interruption.
All right, so while we talked about, and you told me they were all within reasonable degree of scientific certainty, that 1 and 2 could have come through the back window.
Could have, less likely.
Okay. 1 and 2, now that you know there's a hole in the roof, could have come from off to the passenger side.
Yes.
Okay. Or 1 and 2, if the head is in the right position, could have come from the hood of the mount.
Yes.
Okay. Now let's talk about wound number 2. We had a conversation about that previously, correct?
Yes.
And I asked you what position would the head have to be in order for wound number 2 to have come through the front windshield, correct?
Yes.
And I think you indicated to me that the head would have to be turned at about a 45-degree angle, have to be bent over, his head would have to be parallel with the radio, and he'd be staring at her shoes.
I don't remember the 45-degree angle part, but yes, he would be looking down, most likely at her feet area, yes,
And
with
you
his head
indicated
down.
that his head would be parallel with the radio. Do you recall that?
I do remember talking about the radio, yes, he would be
So
looking
he would
down.
be about like this?
But yeah, his head doesn't need to be turned that far.
This?
Yeah.
Now
Could
where I am
be.
now?
Yes, could be.
Okay. And you're saying that that's where the position that I'm in now is the position that Mr. Russell would have had to be in order to sustain bullet hole number 2 from somebody on the hood of the Malibu, correct?
Close to that, yes.
Which way do you want me to move?
You can sit up a little straighter and
Sure.
put your neck down more.
There?
Yeah. Or now sit up a little bit straighter and put your neck down a little bit more. Yes. So any of these, there's a spectrum.
Okay. So right in about here where I'm moving. Mm-hmm. Wow. And you say when bullet hole number 2 comes in, that you've immediately lost all motor skills.
Pretty immediate.
All right.
Yes.
See, it's, picture. All right. State's Exhibit 983. You recall that?
Yep.
Okay. And that depicts Mr. Russell in the position Mr. Gutierrez and Ms. Royster positioned themselves in here earlier, correct?
Yes.
And his body is all the way up, he's slumped over to the right, and he's behind the passenger, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Slightly behind, partially behind.
In that position, how is he getting 1 or 2 through the windshield, in your mind?
Well, in my mind, if 1 and 2, so here's the time frame thing. If 1 and 2 have already happened,
Okay.
he is sustaining 1 and 2. If they come from the front windshield, his neck is down, and we know his neck is down from number 4, this one that goes here. So if he's down, these 2 come, he doesn't particularly have to be leaned way forward like you were demonstrating. And then all the 15s happen, or some of the 15s happen, he will be pushed back against the seat. It depends how far away he is. Now there's another option. Perhaps he got number 1 while he's leaned forward. Then several of the 15s happen, and he's back a little bit. And while he's back, with his head back, number 2 comes from over here somewhere. Either of those is a possibility. Because I can't particularly say, 15C came before 9 and all of those things.
I understand it, but back to the fact that when you get number 2, you immediately lose all motor skills, right?
So he's not going to be moving himself after that,
You
right?
told me from my pinkies to my toes, I can't wiggle, right? correct?
Right,
I have no control over my bodily movement, correct?
right.
All right, so once again, if he's leaning, looking at her shoes, staring down, and his head is parallel to the radio, because you can even physically do that in this car with the part of the steering wheel. And do you see the steering wheel there?
Yes,
So if he's in the position that you described in order to sustain wound number 2 from somebody on the hood of the Malibu, he's bent over, his head is looking towards her feet, and his eyes are looking towards her feet, and his head is parallel with the radio, correct?
that is one option. That is not the only option.
What other option is there from the hood of the Malibu?
That I just described, where he's nearly seated, but his head is down. That could be the same. And as I had you demonstrate with your back straightening up, as he is straightening you, as you are straightening in demonstrating, the straighter your back is, the more your neck needs to be bent in order for the head to be in the appropriate position. Does that make sense?
If he's in the position that you stated, staring at her feet, his head down, bent over at that degree, and he suffered wound number 2, he wouldn't have the ability to exercise motor skills to sit himself back up.
That is correct.
That's correct. And you're saying that after he sustained that injury, you believe additional shots would move his body backwards?
A little bit.
Would it move
It depends how far you're slumped forward.
Can I have her step down?
Sure.
All right. I don't know how to do this. How does it? So you tell me where we've been. And you want wound number 2 to come, let's say that's the windshield towards the judge.
This is not in the proper position where I would have placed it.
Okay, it's steeper.
So 2 is really going to be more at an angle like
Okay,
this.
so let's say the judge is at the windshield, right?
Well, and by the way, but putting aside the angle of the rod in there, the entrance wound is in about the right place, right?
In about, yes.
Okay.
Okay,
So
pardon
let-
my interruption.
So, let's say that the bench is the windshield, right? Okay, so his head has to be, you told me when I've turned it sufficiently that his head is a position to take that from the windshield.
Can I just demonstrate in the chair? This is not
Okay.
visually working for me. Is that okay?
For sure, start with that.
You're at the windshield. I am Timothy Russell. In order for these wounds to come from there, he has to be either his neck, he's sitting relatively upward, maybe forward a little bit, but his head, his neck would then have to be far down. Or there is a spectrum of move the neck up a little bit, move the back down. Move the neck up a little bit, move the back down.
Right.
Until you get down to where you were demonstrating with parallel to the radio, looking at her shoes like this.
Okay,
So,
but here, I'm gonna put the dummy next to you, okay? Okay, so you're indicating at what point, even with the trajectory, we got the entrance wound coming from there, right? You have to keep this all the way.
turn it the other way. Here.
Okay, well, when it's bent to this angle, that's coming in a parallel line, right?
No. Ignore this. I don't like this rod. It's in the wrong
Here,
position.
take my pen and show me the entrance wound. I'm here, please.
Yeah. Similar to here, but just at a steeper angle.
Okay, so you gotta get, to come into the windshield, you gotta get the head to there, correct?
Yes.
And is this, at this angle, going off more?
I'm just trying to make sure that it's lined up. It's hard to make sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so if this is coming from the front window, his head has to be far down.
Right.
And if his neck is not bent forward, then his torso has to be far forward.
Right.
In order for that to line up. And then the other option that we talked about was this came from over there.
Right.
And if it came from over there, it could be while he's in nearly this position, as in the photo, and this is one of the last ones to come in from that side. Or back, if it came from back there, his head would have likely have been facing the passenger door. Right?
So you've indicated, as you told me, several possibilities. They all include his head bent over, correct? In order to make that trajectory from the front windshield, correct? And then you've indicated that 1 and 2, 1 is almost immediately immobilizing, such that you wouldn't be able to use your motor skills.
Right.
And number 2 would be immediately immobilizing.
Right.
Okay. So if you are bent or slumped over and it is immediately immobilizing, you're not going to pick yourself back up on your own.
That's correct.
Okay. So you're saying that additional shots then would move the head and the body all the way back?
Not if he's leaned all the way over like that. If that's the scenario and he's leaned very far forward, shots here are not going to have enough force to sit him back up. But if he's nearly sitting anyway, or he's kind of behind the arm of Malissa Williams and his head is just forward, then there's no reason for him to not be slumped as he is in these photographs.
Well, if he's behind, if his head is behind Melissa Williams, he couldn't have got number 1 or number 2 from in front of the metal.
If part of his body is behind, let's say his right arm is behind her left arm, that still gives his head enough room to be down, not in her way, or with her not being in his way.
Enough to hit 1 or 2.
Yes.
When you talk about the kinetic force of the bullets to the chest and torso, are you talking about the actual force of the bullets themselves, or are you referring to some involuntary motor reaction that might occur?
No, just the force of the impact itself. He would just, there would be some movement associated with that, not voluntary movement on his part, but just like a sack of potatoes.
Right. Well, what I meant was, can there be some sort of involuntary motor reaction if you're hit in the right place?
Yes.
Spasm or something?
Yes, there can be, yes.
Okay. But that's not what you're talking about. If he was moved by the bullets, it's by the force of the bullets themselves.
Right, and it's not from here to here.
Right.
It's maybe from here to here.
Gotcha.
Is that?
So, based on State's Exhibit 983, that's where he comes to rest at the end, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so we know that at the end he comes to rest behind Melissa Williams with his head back and he's leaning all the way back in the car seat, correct?
Right.
Okay. And that's just as consistent with getting 1 and 2 from the passenger side, correct?
Could be, yeah.
Okay. And it's more consistent with that now that you know if there's a hole in the roof of the car?
Yes.
Okay. And it's just as consistent with receiving 1 and 2 from shots from behind, correct?
That is less likely.
But
it's consistent with, it could have happened that way.
Okay. Well, when I asked you to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, it could have come from the back. It's consistent with it.
It is consistent with, depending on his position, yes.
That's what we all get back to on all of this. Depending on his position, okay, there's no position that you show us that says those shots had to come from the hood of the Malibu, right?
Exactly. There's no 100%.
There's no 100%. So shots 1 and 2 are consistent with coming from a shot through the back.
They could be, yes.
Okay. And they are, 1 and 2 are consistent with shots coming from the passenger side of the Malibu.
They could be, yes.
Okay. And they're more consistent with coming from the passenger side of the Malibu today than they were yesterday, because now you know if there's a hole in the roof.
Yes, especially for number 2.
Okay. So for number 2, you now especially say that it's more consistent that that came from the passenger side, correct?
It is consistent with possibly coming from, yes.
And you've given us scenarios with the head or body bent in various manipulations where that could be consistent with the hood of the Malibu.
Yes, it could be.
So it's consistent with 3 sides of the car.
Correct.
Okay. And we do know, based on the injuries in 1 and especially 2, that if you suffered that injury through the windshield, you would have to slump forward because you've lost your motor skills.
No.
Your head would be down, you wouldn't pick it back up, right?
Your head would be down, but you would not necessarily slump forward unless you were already bent forward. And we talked about several options there.
Let me ask you this. None of the options that have number 1 or 2 coming through the windshield have him laying all the way back like that,
No.
right?
No.
No, I mean, there have to be some forward motion, correct?
There has to be at the very least, there has to be forward chin down.
Right.
At the very least.
But he wouldn't be reclined as he is there, slumped back, just with his chin down. That wouldn't account for that angle.
No.
No. So his torso or body would have to be moving forward, correct?
Not moving forward, but positioned slightly forward, probably, yes.
And probably positioned in front of Miss Williams, correct?
Not necessarily.
She couldn't be in that position and him be positioned forward still, right?
Yes, they could be positioned in that way. They're both moving bodies. They're not, concrete. There are a multitude of possibilities.
I guess that's where we're going to probably just have to agree that there's a multitude of possibilities.
I agree with that, yes,
Okay.
that's true.
And we could play Twister or move ourselves around here all afternoon and come up with all kinds of different possibilities factors, right?
Yes.
Okay. And again, just for 1 and 2, we're going to agree could be from the rear, could be from the passenger side, could have been from the front, based on the positioning of the bodies in the car.
Yes.
When you say there's a multitude of possibilities, you mean about which bullets came from where and when?
Yes.
Pardon my interruption.
And you indicated that once you receive number 2, you become kind of like a sack of potatoes, right?
Well, after your heart stops and you stop breathing, you're not alive, so you're not moving. Yeah.
So there's no more flailing or movement,
Right.
or moving back and forth, right? You're stationary.
Right.
Okay. And any bullets that came after that, you wouldn't be moving, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Take you to the series of 15, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, would you agree that 15B and D come from a different angle than C, E, G, H, and I?
B and D are more left to right,
Right.
and the others are more right to left.
Okay. So B and D in the series of 15 are coming left to right, correct?
Yes. Let me just confirm. Yes.
And C, E, G, H, and I are coming right to left, right?
And A. Well, A doesn't really have a right-left differentiation in my report, but
Right,
yes, you're
right.
correct.
A is just up and down, correct?
Yeah.
So those are distinguishable. The group A is straight up and down, B and D are left to right, the others are right to left.
Yes.
From different angles.
Yes. In anatomic position.
In the anatomic
Right.
position. And again, depends on if you're turning or what you're doing.
Right, exactly. If you're twisting like you just showed.
Wait a minute, Jeff.
Sure.
Do you ever use the term parallel wound tracks?
No, not usually. I think I know what you mean, though.
Okay, particular shots have the same track?
Sort of travel parallel to each other.
Right, like C and E? Would that be accurate?
You know, I can't say. These wounds have such overlapping trajectories and not enough discrete injuries associated with them. I would be hesitant to call anything a parallel wound track out of this cluster of 15, number 15.
What effect does gravity have on the flow of the blood? Does the blood start to settle?
Yes.
Okay.
Downward.
Downward to the lowest point, correct?
Yes.
And when we talked about wound 15B, just to direct your attention back to that, how long was that to death?
15B injured the heart and the left lung. It could have been 10 seconds. It could have been 2 minutes. There's a small range of time there. It could have been a couple of minutes.
And is that also affected by the number of injuries?
Well, yeah, I mean, just in general, the more injuries there are that injure vital organs, the more quicker death will follow.
Did you review the toxicology of Mr. Russell?
Yes.
Do you have that with you?
No.
Approach one.
Sure.
Take a look at that and see if it refreshes your recollection.
Okay.
Start with, have you looked at the toxicology report?
Yes, I have seen it before.
Can you tell us if there's anything significant or any findings that you made based upon that?
The findings of the toxicology report are that Timothy Russell had used cocaine and alcohol.
Well, let's start with the alcohol. What's the alcohol level?
The alcohol level is 0.131 grams per deciliter in the blood.
And would that be a reading such as we're accustomed to say what drunk driving is or something of that nature?
This is above the level for drunk driving.
That's 0.08, correct?
0.08, yes.
And would that 0.13 correlate to that 0.8? And that's the same measurement?
Oh, yes, same units, yes.
Okay. We're not comparing apples and oranges.
Right, no.
0.08 is legal, the limit for legal driving, and he was 0.13.
He is above the legal limit.
Okay.
Yes.
And are you familiar with the amount of alcohol it takes to register a reading?
Well, that depends on body habitus and other factors. How fast you're drinking.
How fast you metabolize, correct?
Right.
Okay. Generally, the 150-pound man goes to 0.02 with one beer, one shot, or one glass of wine.
Right, one serving of alcohol, yes.
How much did Mr. Russell weigh?
Oh, he weighed 217 pounds.
So it takes a 150-pound guy, one serving of alcohol to get to 0.02, right?
For an average person,
Right.
yes.
So if you're that weight, it would take almost 1 3/4
Perhaps.
to get to the 0.02. And then he's 7 times that, correct?
Yeah, 6 to 7 times.
So 2, so roughly 13 to 14 active drinks in his system.
Perhaps. I mean, that's quick math, but yeah.
Okay. Let's go to the cocaine. What's the levels?
The parent cocaine level is less than 0.125 milligrams per liter in the blood.
Okay.
That's the only number that's for the cocaine.
You and I discussed the cocaine use when we spoke earlier, correct?
Yes.
And I indicated to you that when I spoke to Dr. Frelo, he determined that the levels were such that he was probably smoking crack cocaine very recently, if not in the last 20 minutes before his death, correct?
Yeah.
There's probably a better way you can ask that question, but overruled.
Well, I guess I'll ask you something.
Why don't you ask her if she has an opinion and if so, the basis for
Do
it?
you have an opinion on how recent the cocaine use was?
Within minutes.
Within minutes of his death?
Yes.
Okay, so he was smoking crack cocaine within minutes of his death.
He was using cocaine within minutes of his death. I would not say specifically that he was smoking crack cocaine.
He was using some form of cocaine within minutes of his death.
Yes.
You indicated that you were working as a fellow here in Cuyahoga County when you performed this autopsy.
Yes, sir.
How many autopsies had you done prior to this one?
About 100, maybe.
Okay.
100. I'm just thinking, maybe 110, something in that range.
Because you no longer work for Cuyahoga County, you're now a paid actor, correct?
In order to testify
Right.
back in Cuyahoga County, yes.
Saying there's anything wrong with them, just saying that's true, right?
That is true.
And what do you charge?
Currently I charge $200 an hour.
Correct. When did you first discuss the paths and trajectories and things that you testified to here today with the prosecutor's office?
I don't remember. We've had several recent conversations, but I met with attorneys regarding this case while I was still a fellow. I don't recall.
Were they prosecutors or were they other civil attorneys?
I think they were civil attorneys.
You don't recall the first time you met with the prosecutors?
Not particularly. I mean, I know we've had several recent conversations, but I don't know when. I couldn't give you a date off the top of my head.
And then just to sum up again, because the body is pliable and the body moves and we don't know all the positions it can be in, we can again speculate all afternoon about where a particular shot came from, correct?
Yes.
But we can say, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, that shots 1 and 2 could have come from the rear, could have come from the passenger side, including through the roof, or could have come from the front.
Overruled. If she disagrees, she can tell me.
Correct?
Correct.
Thank you, Doc.
It is not my intention to be redundant. It's only my intention to make sure I grasp the gist of your testimony. The bullets that came through entrance wounds 1, 2, 15B, and 15C, any one of them taken alone would have been fatal. Do you concur?
I agree.
The bullet that accounted for entrance wound 6 was potentially fatal, taken alone.
Yes.
The bullet that accounted for entry wound 15E, taken alone, was potentially fatal, having destroyed the liver.
Yes.
The several bullets that are basically account for 15A, D, and then F through the rest, any one of those or all of them taken together without the other ones we just mentioned, 1, 2, 6, 15B, C, and E, may have been fatal. You just can't say which one of them was or whether it was a combination that would have been fatal.
Correct.
And finally, you are unable to proffer an opinion about which order these wounds were received.
Correct.
Thank you thank you for answering those questions. Mr. Bell, do you have any redirect examination?
Yes, sir. Mr. Shaughnessy asked you a number of questions about different possibilities. Everything is possible. Is that correct?
Lots of things are possible, yes.
And of those scenarios, what was the most likely that you discussed before?
Objection.
As I said earlier, when I asked you questions, I wanted to clear up your direct. I have to go through my notes. Did you testify in direct about which was most likely in terms of, did you answer this base question on direct? And or did you include an to this effect in your report?
No.
We'll go off the record for one moment. Can you find the exact question that was just asked and then tell me what it is and we'll go back on the record?
And of those scenarios, what was the most likely that you discussed before?
And which scenarios did Mr. Bell allude or refer to?
Question. Mr. Shaughnessy asked you a number of questions about different possibilities. Isn't that correct? Answer,
Right.
lots of things are possible. And of those scenarios, what was the most likely that you discussed before?
Well, let me go back on the record then. So, Doctor, the question before you is, of those scenarios, what was the most likely? Before I sustain or not the objection, do you know what scenarios Mr. Bell is referring to?
No, I would ask for clarification on that.
Okay, so this objection's overruled. But let's try to get to what you're exactly asking. Well, I think here's. And by the way, this may be some redirect based upon my own questions because I did ask her, and I'm paraphrasing. Can you say which bullet came in, when, and in what order, and I believe she said no. So the objection to the question at hand is overruled, but we've basically, Mr. Bell, heard the answer, which is, can you tell me what you mean? More or less, right?
Correct.
Right.
Thank you. You have been asked cross-examination about whether or not shots from different locations could have caused these wounds, correct?
Yes.
As far as the most likely scenario of those that you were asked, what is the most likely scenario?
Objection, Your Honor.
All right, so now, well, hold on a second. I'll hear your objection.
Your Honor, at some point, this whole examination has to come down to a legal standard relative to opinion testimony. It has to be based upon reasonable medical certainty. She's already testified that she does not have any expertise relative to the energy of the bullet penetrating a car. And so she's only confident about testifying a bullet going through a body. So that's one issue. And now we're going into diluting the standard. I think it's evident that she cannot say based on reasonable medical certainty all these various opinions. This is all speculation.
So that I understand your question, Mr. Bell, by which scenario you mean from which direction? Back,
That's correct.
passenger side, or front? Is it most likely these bullets came?
That's correct.
Are you qualified to answer that question?
Yes, based on my interpretation of the wound track in the body and what his motion could have been only with respect to the body.
Okay, in that event, especially given that it was inquired into on cross, then you may respond so the objection is overruled. And the question before you is, and I'm paraphrasing because this isn't exactly what he said, do you have an, and this is, I'm paraphrasing, but in an important way, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty about from which direction wounds 1 and 2 came?
Based on the wound tracks in the body and the amount of maneuvering that one can do inside of a vehicle in this limited space, it's not like he's walking down the street and can turn cartwheels. If these 2 wounds came from the front, from an elevated position in front of him, his neck must have been down and or his torso is leaned forward. That is very likely. If 1 and or 2 came from the right side where the passenger door windows or that hole in the roof, his head could have been very similar to the placement in this photograph that's on the screen, or facing the passenger window. That is also likely, particularly for wound number 2. In order for the wounds to have made this trajectory and come from behind the vehicle, he would most likely have had his neck extended backward. And we know from several of his other injuries that he is leaning and bent forward. So I would consider the back to be the least likely of the 3. The right side of the vehicle is more likely for wound 2 than for wound 1. And the front elevated windshield could have been for 1 and 2, that's likely.
Same objection.
Noted, the motion to strike is overruled. And your next question.
Based upon the cross-examination, is wound number 2 still the last or one of the last shots?
Most likely it is, yes.
And is wound
Overruled.
and is wound number 2 and wound number 1 still ante-mortem.
Yes.
And is that based upon a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Yes.
Your Honor, your question is making, I'm sorry, objection. Is what?
The opinions that she just gave about ante-mortem and wounds 1 and 2 being among the last of the projectiles to enter his body.
And Mr. Shaughnessy showed you the defense exhibit. Defense exhibit E.
Yes.
And he's shown you, are there any trajectory rods in defense exhibit E?
No.
Showing you state's exhibit 514. Are there trajectory rods there?
Yes.
And state's exhibit 510. Are there trajectory rods there as well?
Yes.
Do you see the same bullet hole from defendant's exhibit E in the state's exhibits 510 and 14, which have trajectory rods?
Yes.
You see the angle of those rods?
Yes.
In relation to where you saw where the body was located?
Yes.
These trajectory rods, do they come from a side and forward position?
They appear to, yes.
When we discussed the roof shot, the top of the roof, you had pointed straight up, correct?
As being a hole that could cause 1 or 2?
Correct?
Yes.
And are these pictures depicting an angle with a trajectory?
Yes, there is a trajectory rod.
First of all, in your opinion, showing you these two and seeing the trajectory rods, could those have even hit the decedent?
Objection.
I thought I asked you earlier about your qualifications or not to testify to where a bullet can go or how it might deflect. Didn't you tell me you're not sure?
You asked me about kinetic energy changes when it passes through another object. All I would say about this.
Objection.
Well, overruled then. Go ahead. You may respond to his initial question.
That's fine.
So do I go?
Yeah, please reply.
This is, if the bullet impacts here, it may fragment, it may change direction. If it continues in this same path, it would likely not hit either occupant of the vehicle. But there is the option that it fragments or changes direction when it impacts the car. Just like when a bullet impacts a bone in a body, it can change direction or fragment.
Yes. And then, some more, please.
Sure.
Did any of that discussion change your opinion about whether or not the heart was still beating and the victim, Timothy Russell, was still alive at the time of the wounds, number 1 and number 2?
No.
Thank you. No further questions.
Actually, hold on, Mr. Bell, because I forgot to ask the doctor a question, and in fairness, if you want, you should have the opportunity for a redirect off of the courts as well. Did you say you're here today as a retained expert?
I am.
Okay. Anything based on that?
No.
We'll go off the record for one moment. Do you have an estimate?
Just about 2 minutes.
Okay. You okay, Rick? right, so we're back on the record. Any recross, Mr. Shaughnessy, based on what's been asked since you last inquired?
Did you ever write an additional report about the trajectories that you testified to here today?
Other than this one?
Yes, other than that.
No.
I mean, a report that says that's consistent with coming from the rear of the car, or the passenger side of the car, or the front of the car.
No.
Okay. Before today, you never knew that there was even a hole in the roof, correct, of the Malibu?
No. I have seen that picture with the trajectory rod before, but that is not what, when I was referring to no holes in the roof, I meant these holes.
Really?
Yes, really.
Okay. So when you said
There are no holes above Timothy Russell.
when you said there were no holes in the car,
I misspoke.
in the roof, you said 3 or 4 times in your original direct examination that the shot could have come through the roof because there were no holes in the roof. There were no holes in the roof. There were no holes in the roof. You knew there was a hole in the roof. You just didn't think there was a hole in the right spot, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
There were no holes in the roof above Timothy Russell.
Okay. So, but there is a hole in the roof that comes through from 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock across the roof, correct?
Yes, there is.
Okay. And it's moving in a right to left manner.
Yes.
Right. Across the car, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Where the people are, right? Into the passenger compartment, right?
Into the past. Yes. It's on the screen there.
And it's just as likely, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty again, that the shot could come from the back, from the passenger side, or the front, correct?
All 3 are possibilities.
To
Yes.
a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shaughnessy. Doctor, I am not going to tell you you're under oath. In fact, you're not under oath, and you are free to go.
Thank you.
Appreciate you coming down here. When we break for the day, we'll resume at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Who do you expect the first witness to be, Mr. Bell or Ms. Royster, whoever?
Will it either be Mr. Roberts or Mr. Field?
Robert. Before we break for the day, though, is there some miscellaneous matter that either hasn't been addressed or hasn't been fully addressed that one party or the other thinks should be made of record? I'll ask the plaintiff first. Defendant.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, at this point, I would make a motion to strike the testimony of this paid witness presented by the state relative to her testimony that went beyond her autopsy that she performed in this case. She's basically been called upon today after, evidently, if I understand her testimony correctly, recent phone calls or meetings with the prosecutors, where she's now giving opinion testimony relative to trajectories and bullet paths of the bullets in this particular case coming through vehicles. They have a duty, if they're going to elicit this type of testimony, to obtain an expert report and present it to the defense. So we then present it to our experts that were given them for quite some time. And we just don't feel it's